Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drewsguitarshop in Seattle, Washington, and today I wanted to do a quick video about humidifiers. Basically what they are, how they work, when you should use one, when you should not use one, and how to make one. Let's get into how these little guys work. When we're talking about humidifiers in this video, we're not talking about the big guys that you put into a room to humidify like an entire room in a house. Usually those will have a motor in them, and they'll kind of look a little bit like an air conditioner. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the little guys that go inside a sound hole or inside the guitar case. And are meant to really only provide hydration for a single instrument. And how these little guys work is all pretty much the same, which is that you have a container, and inside that container you have a substrate that is absorbent. And there are vents in the container to allow water that is placed into that substrate to evaporate out of it and to hydrate the area that the humidifier is in. So really, they're not terribly scientific. Basically, put water in case, water make case wetter is basically how these things work. So again, it's not terribly complex. Pretty straightforward once you realize what's going on inside these things. So let's talk about like when you would want to use one of these things. When you want to use one of these things is when your relative humidity is too dry for the instrument. Now, how do you tell if something is too dry? Well, I'm talking specifically mostly to you guys who live in the Midwest and the Southwest, but basically anywhere. If you've got dry weather, this part of the video is for you, and take notes. Guitars and other instruments are usually built in a factory in a controlled environment that's kept to around 40% relative humidity. That is to say, the saturation that the air can maintain at its temperature, that is how much like moisture is in the air. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about relative humidity, and that's really what you want to be concerned about with instruments. That 40% relative humidity that they were built at is also the ideal that they are stored at. And so that's something that's worth keeping in mind when you're deciding whether or not you need humidification. They're built at 40% relative humidity, or 45, or somewhere around that neighborhood, because when instruments are shipped out of that factory, they're not typically going to be going to an environment that is too crazy one way or the other outside of that. That is to say that, if you build them kind of in the middle, if you send them one place that's kind of low, it's usually going to be okay. If you send them someplace that's kind of high, it's usually going to be okay. But it's not always okay. And when it's not okay, and it's not okay into the low end where you have a lack of humidity, that is the time to use one of these guys. Now, as far as like where that line is drawn, it's one of those things that can depend. Offhand, I would say that you should maybe think about getting a humidifier when you have the relative humidity kind of dropping below the 30s. So if you're into the 20s, as far as your relative humidity goes, that might be the time to consider getting a humidifier. Down below 20 is certainly, absolutely time that you should be putting a humidifier in the case. And usually the guitar will kind of let you know. There are problems that occur when something is dried out. Some of them are less bad than others, but some of them can be quite bad. So what you're going to notice if a guitar is lacking humidity is that the bulge in the soundboard, there is a radius in your soundboard, which is usually around like 50 feet or something around that territory. So that little bit of roundness is normal. If you have a completely flat top on a modern guitar, that's usually an indicator that there is too little moisture. It means that that membrane that has sucked up the water and gone has let go of its water and gone. Imagine sad trombone noise. That flatness is usually an indicator that there's an issue. Something else that can happen too, even if you don't notice the bulge, is that the string action will oftentimes take a real dip. And if the strings all of a sudden are too low to the board and you're getting all kinds of buzzing and it's like a recent problem, that may be indicative of some humidity issues, and you might want to check out that soundboard, see if it looks a little flatter than normal, and that may be a time when you want to humidify. Other things that can occur from lack of humidification are cracks in the soundboard. In some cases, braces letting go. In some cases, you'll see the fret ends start to poke out the ends of the fretboard as things shrink, because basically what's happening, you know how a sponge works. When you have a sponge that's full of water, it's all poofed out, and then when it dries out, it kind of shrinks. Well, your wood in the guitar does the same thing, because your wood is basically a big sponge. It's a bunch of little straws that are all kind of stuck together. And when those straws are full of moisture, the thing tends to expand, and when they let moisture out, they tend to shrink. So that's a good way that you might be able to visualize it. So again, to sum up, if you're looking at humidity that's, down below the 30s, I'd say it's time to maybe look into a humidifier. If you're down in Las Vegas, Nevada, your relative humidity is probably pretty low usually, and that is an environment where you need humidification. Now, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, like I am, humidification isn't really something that you need to worry about, which is going to help me segue into my next topic here, when you shouldn't use a humidifier. So again, that 40% relative humidity is really important to consider. So anything too crazy from that 40% is going to be kind of bad for your instrument. And in the case of something that's kind of too much for your instrument, I would say that if you start kind of hovering above 60, that is kind of the yellow zone. That's where I would kind of start to pay attention to things. And if you get much above that, if you're getting into the 70% territory and staying there, a lot, I would say, yeah, absolutely, that may be an issue with too much humidification. In those instances, you may actually want to look into getting a dehumidifier, but what you definitely don't want to do is add to the problem by putting a humidifier in the case. That can also cause problems. It's not a harmless thing to just drop this thing that is going to dramatically change the environment of the guitar in there and just kind of cargo cult it. I'm just going to put this in there because someone told me to, not because I know that I need to for this reason. You need to have the reason, and you need to have the knowledge of what that's going to do before you go ahead and just cowboy ahead with that shit, because it's going to have the potential of damaging your instrument. Well, what are the risks? If you over-humidify, you end up with a risk of causing mold and mildew to appear on the instrument, which some of you might go, that's not such a big deal. Well, I've had instruments cross my bench that were growing fuzzy mold on their nitrocellulose lacquer finish, and that mold was feeding off of the cellulose in that finish. And just burned through it in some spots, completely obliterating, sunbursts and whatnot. It's really nasty. Not to mention just it stains. Mold and mildew can cause these little black, splotches to occur all over an instrument and make it look really kind of, unless you like your instrument looking like a leopard. Something else that can happen is that, how we were talking about how the soundboard kind of poofs out when it's hydrated and kind of goes down? Well, too much of that poofing can also be a problem. That can cause a bridge to separate, it can cause braces to separate, and it can also cause cracks to occur. So, just in general, over-humidification is kind of a bad idea. You don't want to get into putting one of these things in your guitar case, again, just because you think that you need to, unless you know that you need to, unless you know why you're putting it in there. I would just recommend staying away from the whole thing. And if you live in an environment that's fairly temperate, a lot of times you don't need a humidifier or a dehumidifier at all. Most of the time you're just going to be fine putting the guitar in the case, storing it in a decently safe environment, and it's good. Just make sure that you're not putting it next to a heater or the shower or something that's going to produce some kind of humidification or heat change that is very dramatic and regular. You want to keep things kind of stable. Think about you would store cigars or something like that. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. Anyway, moving on here. So because these things are pretty basic, they're pretty easy to make. This here is my humidifier. I only have the one in my shop because generally speaking, I don't need to use this thing too often. The only time I use this thing is when I get an instrument in here that's clearly been stored in an environment that's not had enough humidity. Usually in these cases I'll ask the person and I'll find out that they have like central air that's running during the summer, or something along those lines, something that's a little unusual for Seattle. And that's the instance in which I'll bust this thing out and I'll use it to kind of rehydrate an instrument that has a bunch of cracks in it. But you can see this thing isn't terribly complicated. This is a pickup case that I got from a Seymour Duncan pickup that I ordered back in the day, and that's even the sponge that it was shipped in. This is what I use. I'll just soak the sponge with a little bit of water and toss that cap on it, and I'll put it right in the case with the guitar. And it does an excellent job, and I've been using it for years. You can see how old this plastic is. It's kind of busted up. But, I've also done a thing where I've put a shop towel that I've kind of soaked a little bit in water and put it inside of a plastic Ziploc bag with some knife holes cut in it. And that also works just fine. These aren't complicated things. The main thing to look out for is that you're not oversaturating to the point where you've got liquid water dripping out of the thing. You don't want that anywhere near your instrument. You want to wet the sponge, kind of squeeze the excess out, and then put it in here, and then close it up and put it in the case. But you want that sponge to not be leaking any water, because that'll get into the cushioning in your case and cause that to mold. It'll cause your guitar to be over humidified usually, and it can damage finish and other stuff. So make sure that you're not completely soaking this thing and just putting it in there like an aquarium and thinking that's going to be okay, because it's not going to be okay. So yeah, I have complex feelings about these because there is a industry associated with these little guys, and when you have an industry that is profit driven and trying to sell as many units as they can, they're not always going to be truthful with you in the way that they advertise. Most of the ads that I see for humidifiers don't talk about relative humidity really. They might mention instruments being dry or something like that, but they don't give you numbers a lot of the time. And they're generally trying to kind of push you into buying the thing and using it regardless of whether or not you need to. And this leads to this kind of mentality that I've seen a lot in players that come to my shop and in guitar forums and sometimes videos and whatnot, where there's just this assumption that this is this necessary thing that you have to have all the time, that you need to use all the time, and it's just not the case. Whenever I see something like that, that's like an industry-associated, trinket or something that is associated with guitars, there's always this kind of mystique that builds up around it of like, oh, I have to use this thing. And oftentimes that comes with the cargo culting of people just going ahead and installing the thing or using it without really giving a thought as to why. And if you take nothing else away from this video, what I'd like people to start considering more is, why are you doing the thing that you're doing? Why are you buying the thing that you're buying? What is the purpose that it will serve, and do you know that it's going to serve that purpose well? Are some of the questions that I would like to ask people about some of these gimmicky things. And I almost would consider humidifiers to be one of those gimmicky things, just in the way that they're advertised and the way that they're sold, and the types of questions that tend to be generated by by those advertisements and by guitar forum folks and everything else, because it's again one of those things that can really seriously hurt your instrument very quickly, and is one of those things that you should really have a very good idea about why you're using it and what it's doing in the case. In cases where you need the humidifier, you should use it. In cases where you need to use that humidifier, usually the humidity is going to be fairly low on a regular basis, you're going to be dealing with like under 30% relative humidity as your kind of norm, and you might be dripping, you might be dipping into the 20s, on months, weeks when it's really dry. That's when you want to be using one of these things. That's when you want to be considering using one of these things. And when you don't want to be considering using one of these things is basically any other time. Any other time, these things can cause a lot of damage and a lot of heartache, because the sort of damage that these things cause is just awful. I've had a bunch of guitars in here in Seattle that have come into my shop with over-humidification damage, and it's not because our weather is super wet. People who don't live in Seattle have this idea that we have like rain just all the time, and we don't. We have a pretty dry summer, and our humidity is usually fairly high, relatively speaking to like the Southwest, but we don't generally hit like, dangerous levels of humidity during the year here. Generally speaking, we're around that temperate zone that's pretty good for guitars. Most of the time, you don't need any kind of device with your guitar to lower or get more humidity into the case. It's normally fine. And I would say that most of you watching this video probably live in a pretty temperate, kind region for guitars to exist in, again, because that is the whole idea behind building guitars at a 40% relative humidity. So, in summation, these things are pretty dumb, they work well, and they're very simple to make, which is another reason why I don't think I would necessarily go out and spend a whole lot of money for a humidifier. They're so easy to make. This could be like a cream cheese container or something with sponge in it. It's just not that complicated. Again, in summation, these things, work well when you need them for the purpose that they were designed, but they should only be used in instances where they're necessary, and they can be made very, very cheaply. I don't know that I would send anybody out to get like some, super cool, pro-made humidifier when something like this or a bag with a rag in it works just as well. So, I hope that video was helpful. If it was, and you feel like kicking me a few bucks, there's a link to my Ko-fi in the description of the video. And if you wanted to sign up for my Patreon, it's like $1 a month minimum or something like that. It helps me make these videos because I do have to take time out of my workday to make these, and I don't get paid for them. So, not saying that you have to. Definitely don't if you're not in a financial position to do so. But it helps me out a little bit if you can and want to. There's also a link down there to my website. You can find an excellent page, highly related to this topic, on my website about caring for your stringed instrument, which is pretty much applicable to all stringed instruments. I tried to take my time writing that thing back when I wrote it. And, there's some contact info on that page if you happen to be in the Seattle area and in need of some instrument repair. I do all fretted instruments. The only thing I don't work on is violin family stuff. But anyway, there's also a lot of videos on my channel, and a lot of them are like this, sort of tips, tutorials, and whatnot. So anybody who's an aspiring luthier might get something out of that, or anybody who's a player. If you're into guitars, there might be something in there for you. Anyway, thank you for watching, and have a good one.